We have a great presentation today, and I'm pleased to welcome our speaker, Jen Weston, who is a postgraduate research associate at Exeter University. And Jen will be talking to us today about nature connection, nature capital, and citizen science, and what influences these factors. So over to you, Jen.
Thank you, Colette. Thanks ever so much. If I share my screen so everyone can see my presentation. Can everyone see that okay? I'm gonna do the reverse and say if anyone can't see it, let me know. It's probably a more sensible thing to say, isn't it? Fantastic. So I'll just minimize my screen. Sorry. There we go. So yeah, thanks Colette for introducing me. So my name's Jen Weston. Hopefully you can see my contact details there. So if you do want to contact me after this presentation, please do. I'm on LinkedIn. As Colette said, I currently work at Exeter University as a postgraduate researcher with a really great project called Renew, which you may or may not have heard of. It's a really large project that is working collaboratively with National Trust and Natural England and lots of other stakeholders in taking a kind of people-centered approach to solving problems and solutions to kind of our nature crisis. It's a really interesting project. I started that in January. Prior to that, though, I've been doing a PhD. So I've actually finished my PhD last January, and it was all to do with citizen science. It was at the kind of core of what I was studying, but also to do with nature connections, because that's where my interest lies. So today I'm going to give you a tiny little snippet of some of my findings that hopefully are relevant to anyone who's interested in citizen science. As Colette said at the start, if you've got questions, then please pop them in the chat, but we will have lots of time at the end. I'm hoping to discuss some of the things that are raised in this presentation. So please do feel free to ask questions. Just gonna go through the slides. So the PhD, just for context, was in collaboration with an organisation called the Natural History Consortium. You may or may not have heard of them. They're based in Bristol, and they are a fantastic organisation that puts together stakeholders that are passionate about nature and want to communicate about nature. And they're involved in lots of projects, not just in Bristol, but in the kind of southwest predominantly, but also further afield. They also organise the Communicate Conference, which is a conference all to do with communicating nature. And that's held not just in Bristol now, but in places like London on an annual basis. So they were a great organisation to work with to do with citizen science, because they were particularly interested in who has access to citizen science and what were some of the disparities in accessing citizen science. A bit background about me, because my research was both quantitative and qualitative. I think it's important to provide a little context about the researcher. So that's me as a person. I have, before doing the PhD, had quite a few careers. I grew up, I guess, what you would say in poverty. So I was on free school meals, for example. And all the research out there would say then that because of my upbringing, I guess, I shouldn't be particularly connected to nature, and I probably shouldn't do citizen science, because all the research tells us that the types of people that do citizen science are probably white, affluent, and well educated. And that wasn't the case for me. I did participate in citizen science growing up, and I felt really connected to nature. So I guess I thought, well, I'm a bit of an anomaly, really. And I thought, and I still think, I believe that was a lot to do with my upbringing, and my in particular my father. So my dad loved nature, and so we grew up surrounded by wildlife, talking about wildlife, doing things in nature. And I think that had a big part to play in why I feel so connected as an adult. But I wanted to kind of prove that from an academic perspective, I guess. So that was a kind of real kind of the scaffolding for some of the questions, the research questions I had in my project. And in particular, the kind of impact of nature connection. I'm not going to talk too much about what that means today. There's lots more research out there now, but basically nature connection is about how a person psychologically feels they are part of nature, I guess. And it's a relatively new field of research, but there's lots of stuff out there at the moment. And you might have heard this kind of these phrases being bandied about. And it's a really useful thing for policy, but also for practitioners, because what it does is it helps us to get people connected to nature. And we know that if you feel connected to nature, you will be healthier, your mental health and well-being will be better, but also you're more likely to exhibit pro-conservation behaviours. And what that means is that it can help solve this nature and kind of mental health crisis that we have sadly going on at the moment. So my research centred around nature connection, its links, if you like, to citizen science. And we know that there's disparities in accessing citizen science. So as I said just now, people that tend to be white, they tend to be well educated, they tend to have high socioeconomic status. And for other people, it's much more difficult to access. They might not feel like it's a place for them to do, or it might not be part of their kind of social or cultural reference in their everyday lives. So that's kind of was the background to the research. And that led to this kind of, for me, one of the questions I had in my research was what early life experiences, so what were you exposed to growing up? What social references, i.e. your family, and what cultural references, so things further afield that you might do at school, you might watch it on TV, you might be involved with it online. How do they influence somebody's pathway to their nature connection? But also to whether they choose to participate, because it is a choice, it's a behaviour, in citizen science, and in particular nature-based citizen science. That's what I was interested in. And a backdrop for me was, and how are these influenced by structure inequalities? So when I ask this question, I'm thinking about how does that person's upbringing affect, how does their ethnicity, how does whether they identify as having a disability, how do their socioeconomic status, how do those things impact their relationship with nature, but also whether they participate in citizen science. I won't go too much into this. I'm not aware who's in the crowd at the moment, but if you're interested in kind of a theoretical framework, this is what I applied. So this is the kind of the structure for the research. So I knew that unfortunately not everyone has equal access to nature and equal access to citizen science effectively. And that growing up will affect things like your knowledge and skills, it has an impact on those social and cultural references that I've mentioned, but also the opportunities you encounter. You're only going to know about citizen science if someone presents that opportunity to you. And if you're hanging out with people, your family or your friends, and they are really nature people or really citizen science people, you're going to hear about it. If those people don't talk about nature and citizen science, you're not going to have those same opportunities. And that is really important, I believe. That affects your motivations and some of the barriers that you might encounter when someone on a daily basis asks themselves, do I want to go in nature? Do I want to participate in citizen science? So those social and cultural things and those opportunities are really important. And that's what my research was about. It affects someone's decision and opportunity to participate in citizen science, but also their relationship with nature as well. And you might have seen this word up here, nature capital. I'll explain what that is now. So I used this as a tool in my research. Nature capital is loosely something I borrowed from something called science capital. So science capital was used in the kind of early 1990s, 2000s to examine why was it that not everyone is choosing to do science GCSEs or A levels. And what was found was that if you belong to a global majority ethnic group, or you come from a kind of poorer socioeconomic background, you're less likely to choose science at school and go on and study at college and at university level. So a lot of research was done to establish why that was. So loads of surveys were sent to schools, and it basically led to this kind of theory of science capital. And what that meant is that lots of young people from minoritised groups didn't feel like science was something for them. And that was based on the opportunities, the social opportunities and the cultural opportunities they were exposed to growing up. So I thought, well, actually, that sounds really useful because I know that what I was exposed to growing up had an impact on me. And so I wanted to borrow this kind of theory. And I did this scientifically, obviously. I used kind of statistical analysis to then adapt it to something called nature capital. And what that enabled me to do was to look at this kind of social and cultural references and opportunities someone has growing up, um, and look to see whether that will help them on their pathway to nature connection, but also help them feel like citizen science was something that they could do, basically. What it also gave was a score for each person that participated in my research. So I'm going to go on and just talk a little bit about some of the methods I use so you know where the kind of analysis came from. So I did a survey. So 270 people completed my survey. That was on various platforms. I wanted to try and reach people that hadn't ordinarily participated in citizen science or might not feel connected to nature. That was my aim. As you could probably tell from my tone, I wasn't particularly successful in that. So it was launched on various social media platforms via the NHC, but also on Facebook. There was a campaign for people that felt disconnected to nature. So 270 people answered that. And then from the survey, I asked people that felt disconnected with nature or who had not ever done citizen science for an interview. And I managed to speak to 15 people from the survey. So, which in qualitative research is actually quite a representative number of people to speak to. So I'm going to just share with you some of the findings now, some of the key, not all the findings, because we would be here for days, but some of the snippets from the research, from the survey findings and from the interview findings. So just some demographics. Now, sadly, as I said just now, my survey wasn't representative of the wider population as much as I tried. So, for example, it was predominantly female that answered the survey, which is very common in these types of survey. The highest representation were between the age of 35, 44, 45 and 54, which again is very, very common. I only wanted to interview adults. I wasn't up for this research. It wasn't about children. They were predominantly people that identified as being white. 81% stated they did not live with a disability. And actually, that particular cohort was the only one that was representative of wider society when I compared that to kind of wider society demographics. And 86, again, the majority of these people were educated to degree level or above, which again is very reflective of people that participate in citizen science. What we would refer to maybe as more affluent. So just some basic kind of survey numbers for you. So the first slide here asks the question about what age did you start appreciating nature? And so the person could choose the age group in which their appreciation of nature began. And the majority of people said it was under the age of 18. And again, this is what we would anticipate. So that connection with nature starts very young, and that's backed up by the research in this sector. This graph is all about it aggregated totals. If you're not aware what that means, that basically just means the people who answered this question could give more than one response. So it's the total number of responses as opposed to the total per person. So this question asked about what were the influential figures that encourage you to get involved with nature growing up. And overwhelmingly, most people said it was a family member or caregiver. And there were lots of, I'll go into the interviews in a moment a little bit, but most people spoke about parents or grandparents, actually. Those were the most influential figures. So again, we're starting to form a picture here of people get involved under the age of 18 as a child, and those social references, i.e. parents, grandparents, caregivers, are very important when people are forming their kind of connection with nature. The second highest answer there was role models that you didn't know personally. So that could be TV figures, and they came up. David Attenborough came up quite a lot, bearing in mind the people that answered this were generally a bit older, and that was a real influential figure as well. People like David Attenborough, but not just David Attenborough. So again, that's a cultural reference more so of what influences people, and thinking about those types of role models, that would mean that that TV has to be on in your house and a David Attenborough program needs to be on, and that isn't going to be the case for every household. How I asked the question about how did you engage with nature growing up? So not everyone directly involves themselves with nature. Some people get out in nature, but that's not always the case. So this question, the types of responses people could ask about were watching TV programs, reading books, looking online, getting involved in activities maybe at home or outside of the home, or visiting a science centre or museum. So these are quite cultural references of the things people might have been involved with, just to learn a bit more about what particularly people were doing to engage with nature. And this was more interesting. So the results were a bit more varied for this. So lots of people watched TV programs, but also lots of people visited a science centre or museum, and I'll come back to that in a moment, what kind of that means. Of that particular group that visited the science centre, the majority of those people identified as being white as well. So a bit about the interviews, and then we'll put this together and we'll go back to the main research question, and then there'll be a chance to ask some questions. So for context to the survey, the 15 people I spoke to, I asked them more about what kind of things happen growing up. So early life exposure was key, basically. So people spoke very fondly about spending time with their family members, parents, grandparents. As you might anticipate, things like walking. Walking came up lots and lots. Everyone mentioned walking with parents. So don't underestimate that as an excellent way to form a connection with nature. But also things like playing near home, playing near school, as you might anticipate. Holidays were also mentioned frequently. And holidays in this country were very, very important. So people spoke very fondly of the coast and of places like Dartmoor, for example, and spending time in nature. That was really a predominant theme as well. Now, I mentioned this just now, access to nature is not equal. So I'm sure you've all heard about research post-COVID that not everyone has nature within 15 minutes of home. We don't have equal access. And that's particularly kind of exemplified if you belong to a global majority group. Also, museums I mentioned just now and how important they were for some people. If you are in the age category of 40 to 50 years old, when you were visiting museums when you were younger, they were very different places than what they are now. There's some amazing projects out there to kind of decolonize museums and to make them a more welcome and accessible place. But I think going back kind of 30, 40 years, that wasn't the case. And so most visitors to museums back in the kind of 70s and 80s and early 90s were basically, majority were white. So these cultural references are really important when it comes to kind of somebody forming a connection with nature. Now, a few kind of key takeaway stats that I'll come back to, and we'll kind of link these things together. So when I examined the mean nature connection score for people who had not attended citizen science, it was 70. The score is out of 100, by the way. So the mean score was 70 out of 100 who did not attend citizen science growing up. And then the mean nature connection score for people who had attended was higher at 81. And then statistically, people who've taken part in citizen science at any point tended to feel more connected to nature. Now that isn't causal. So I can't say for definite, if you've taken part in citizen science, you're more likely to feel connected to nature, or is it the other way around? If you feel more connected to nature, you're more likely to attend citizen science. But these two things are definitely associated with each other. And in my research, I explored citizen science as being a gateway to nature connection, or nature connection being a gateway to citizen science, and us to think more clearly about those two things and the fact that they are linked. There's a lot of amazing work being done to try and get more people participating in citizen science, but if they don't feel connected to nature, and if it's a nature-based activity, they might not want to attend for that reason. So it might be we need to think more about connecting people with nature before we get them to attend citizen science. Just something to think about. And then lastly, those with higher nature capital schools. Now, remember, nature capital is just the opportunities you have. You can think of it as opportunities, social and cultural references, those opportunities growing up. Those with higher nature capital scores also reported significantly higher nature connectedness scores. So again, that kind of made sense to me. If you're provided with more opportunities growing up to do with nature, you're going to have a better connection with nature as an adult. And we know that then means that as an adult, you're going to have better mental health and well-being, and you're also going to exhibit pro-conservation behaviours, which is what we want really to help the planet and to help people. So I hope that kind of hopefully starts to help you think about these things. I'm just going to summarize that on a quick slide, and then we'll have a quick chat. So remember those associations between nature connection and citizen science. These things are linked. There are associations between the two. Higher nature connection, more likely to attend citizen science, and vice versa. Higher nature capital, higher nature connection, and it's all to do with those early life experiences, so those things that people, those opportunities that people have. And at the back of that is always worth considering structural inequalities. So not everyone has access to these similar things, to parents or grandparents or caregivers that are talking about nature. So not everyone has access to being in nature because it isn't where they live. They might not have a garden, they might not have family members that take them to nature. Watching TV, what's on in that person's house that might engage them with nature, that then helps them to build a relationship with it, and things like museums. Thank you ever so much.